Hey everyone, welcome to Hands on Books. If this is your first time here, it's a show where we open books and read some samples and hopefully introduce you to some titles that you might want to check out in the future. I wanted to start this episode with a brief recommendation of Ben Smith's Doggerland. I just finished this and I loved it. Not super happy reading, very desolate and bleak, but I loved the writing style and the story and the setting. Very interesting and extremely well written, in my opinion. So I'll start out with reading the back cover and I'll read a few pages of the opening of the book. "I'll get out," he'd said. "I'll come back for you, okay?" The boy had believed it once. Knew his father couldn't just disappear off the rig. There had to be a plan, but the turbines keep spinning until each begins to break, and the salt air turns everything to rust. And the wind howls, and the ocean swells, and the old man keeps his nets out, not looking for fish, only dredging for the past. So when the boy accidentally uncovers secrets the rig has long been holding on to, he begins to hope again. Could it finally lead him back to his father, and maybe back to dry land? This is Ben Smith's first and only novel, as far as I can tell, put out in 2019. Chapter 1, Bootlaces. Nothing, 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 something. Fourth hook down on the drop line, there was a dark shape. The boy stopped pulling and sat back on his heels. The swell was small that day, and it was more than 3 meters from the platform down to the sea. The boy watched as the shape stretched and buckled beneath the gray water. "Strange fish," he said to no one. The wind was blowing in from the west, consistent, 10 or 11 meters per second by the feel of it, droning through the platform's pipes and grills and pushing the sea into hard ridges. The North Sea shifted from horizon to horizon, like a tarpaulin being dragged over rough ground. It looked sluggish, but, under the surface, currents ripped and surged. It was hard to imagine the sheer tonnages hauling past every minute, every second. The boy wound the line around the railing until it was secure, then took hold of the hanging length, lifted it a few inches, and let it fall. He moved it from side to side, but the hook was lodged. He'd have to pull it up. He moved the line again. It was heavy, whatever it was. He hoped his line wouldn't break. It had taken him a long time to get that length of cord. How long? Months? Years? He looked out at the horizon as if it would give him an answer, but couldn't even pick out where the gray of the sea became the gray of the sky. It was good cord. That was all that mattered. And 100 miles offshore, it wasn't easy to get hold of good cord. Could you even get proper fishing line anymore? The wind squalled and worked itself through the seams of his overalls. Who could he ask? The old man wouldn't know. He didn't know, and there was no one else out there. He stood up, set his feet shoulder-width apart, and pulled his sleeves down over his hands. He moved his hands slowly and kept the rest of his body very still, as if trying to steady himself against the motion of sea and sky. His legs were planted almost a meter apart, and his sleeves barely covered his wide, calloused palms. Of course, the boy was not really a boy, any more than the old man was all that old, but names are relative, and out in the gray some kind of distinction was necessary. He took hold of the line and, using the rail as a fulcrum, began to haul it up out of the water. As soon as the load broke the surface, the line tightened and rasped through his sleeves. He stopped for a moment and let the wind smooth the edges of the pane, then carried on pulling until the fourth hook was level with the platform. He looked down over the rail. It was a load of junk as usual, a greasy mass of netting and plastic, streaming and reeking. The whole thing was tangled into a dense lump, along with an oil can, some polystyrene, and what looked like a burnt-out panel from a door. The boy tied off the line, straightened his back, and blew lightly on his palms. "Good catch," he said. Beside him, the thick steel support rose 20 meters to the rig. Above the rig's squat rectangular housing, the blades of the nearest turbine turned slowly in the washed-out sky. All around, to every horizon, the blades of the wind farm turned. The line spun slowly, 10 turns one way, then a pause, then 10 turns back. The boy laid down on his stomach, reached out and held the netting until it stilled. The field stretched out around him, row after row of turbines, like strange crops. From a distance, they all looked identical, but up close each tower was marked with dark blooms and scabs of rust. There were seepages of oil and grease creeping downward, streaks of salt corrosion reaching up, forming intricate patterns of stalactites and stalagmites. Some of the turbines had slumped down at an angle, their foundations crumbling like silt. Some had damaged blades and threw their remaining limbs around in jolting arcs. Others were missing their blades and nacelle entirely, leaving only the towers standing, like finger posts marking the steady progression of malfunction and storm. He tried to feel his way down to where his hook was caught. The net had floats and some kind of weights threaded through it, and it was twisted up with what could have been strips of weed, but the boy knew were actually sheets of black plastic. He'd been finding them all over the farm recently. He worked his hand in and found the hook, then took a knife out of his pocket and began to cut away at the netting, strand by strand, until it slumped down into the water, leaving just the hook and the object it was stuck in. It was a boot, black, company issue, the same as the boy's. Except, where his were dark and supple from regular cleaning and waterproofing, this one was salt-stiffened, bleached, and cracked, making it look like it was cut from some kind of rough stone. He reached out slowly, tilted it, and looked inside. The laces had come undone and it was empty, which was a relief. He'd found a boot once before, floating through the farm, still laced up tight. When was that? It had been down in the south fields. That boot had been brown, pointed at the toe. The leather and its contents had been scratched and picked apart. There must have been birds around then. And fish. The boy put the knife away in his pocket and took out a battered digital watch. It was missing its strap and one button, and when he touched the display, bubbles of moisture spread inside the casing. It read 5:15. He looked up at the sky and saw, perhaps, a paler patch of cloud in the west. When he closed his eyes, the same patch appeared on the backs of his eyelids. The wind dragged across the rig. Sometimes it sounded thin and hollow. Sometimes it thudded as if it were a solid wall, impossible to move past. The line rocked. The turbines groaned and thrummed. The boy held the boot still. The sole was smooth and washed clean. The sea already cleaning things up, making things anonymous. "Where have you come from?" he said. His voice was barely audible above the wind and the blades, which is probably for the best, because it was a stupid question, and he was talking to a boot. The currents that came from the farm swept in from the oceans and cycled around the whole North Sea, hauling waste and cast-offs out from every coastline. Some days there would be swaths of shining fluid that coated the surface of the water. Other days, shoals of plastic bags and bottles would rise from the depths like bulbous light-seeking creatures. The boy would find tidal barrages and bleached clothing, the brittle shells of electrical appliances. He'd seen furniture and timbers tangled together so they looked like makeshift rafts, and once, a whole house torn loose from its moorings, drifting through the farm, slumped and tilting on its flotation tanks. Days, months, and seasons passed through untethered and indistinct among the flotsam. Sometimes it felt colder and there were more storms, and sometimes a big spring tide would raise the water level up closer to the platform, but it was always cold, and there were always storms. It was spring now, according to the rig's computer. He looked down at his watch. It still read 5:15. He put it away and unhooked the boot carefully from his line. Then he got up off his stomach and sat on the platform, drawing his knees up against the wind and holding the boot in front of him. It could have come from anywhere. It could even have come from the farm. It could have been lost and then got stuck in one of the gyres that looped through the fields, catching anything that was adrift inside and not letting go. It could have been cycling round the turbines, round the edge of the rig for years. The boot was the same size as his own. Whoever it had belonged to would have been about his height, his build. The wind pressed in and the skin on his back tightened. What if... But he couldn't let himself finish the thought. There was no point going over all that. He held the boot out over the water. If he let go, it could be gone in under a minute. In a day, it could be out of the farm. In a few weeks, it could wash up on the coast, or, if it kept going, it could be pushed out north, up and over the pole. Or maybe it wouldn't go anywhere. Maybe it would stay circling the fields. Maybe one day he would check his line and there it would be again, a bit more cracked, a bit more bleached, but the same old boot. And he would pull it up, unhook it, and think the same old thoughts, ask the same old questions, and they would still be stupid questions, and he would still be talking to a boot. He looked out at the water and twisted the boot's lace around his fingers. It was crushed with salt and had kinks from where it had been knotted. Slowly he unpicked it from the stiff eyelets, coiled it, and put it in his pocket. Then he reached out and dropped the boot over the edge of the platform. He watched as it dipped in the swell, pausing for a moment as if remembering its route, before drifting off east and into the gray. Yeah, it's a pretty desolate novel. This review compares it to The Road by McCarthy, which there's definitely some similarities. It deals with some similar themes, such as, I want to say a post-apocalypse, but I don't get the impression that there has been really some explosive apocalypse like in The Road. This is more like an environmental degradation that may have happened slowly over time, and so now they find themselves in this world where, like the first chapter mentions, there's apparently no fish and no birds left, and there's just trash. So anyway, I love this book, and it helps maybe if you put on some weird, creepy ambient music in the background when you read it. I think it definitely accentuates the hopelessness. All right, now let's just open some books. I'm going to try to move pretty fast. I keep buying books and not filming an episode, so my pile of unopened books is getting huge. So I want to get through at least 3 of these. So this is the Brahma Sūtras according to Śrī Rāmānuja, the famous father of the qualified non-dualism school of Vedanta. The Śrī Bhāsya expounds the philosophy of Śrī Rāmānuja in all its essentials. The structure of the work following the structure of the sutras is laid down well. The first 4 sutras concern themselves with 4 considerations of an introductory character. The rest of the first chapter elucidates the crucial passages of the Upanishads that appear to be ambiguous, and the result is a formulation of the philosophy of the Upanishads in a coherent and decisive manner. The second chapter deals with the possible exegetical and philosophical objections to the standpoint. It incidentally examines rival philosophical systems. These 2 chapters represent the metaphysics of Vedanta. The third chapter propounds the sadhana, or the pathway to the attainment of the supreme goal of life. The 4th chapter delineates that goal with all its implications. The last 2 chapters thus relate to the ideals to be achieved. In traditional language, the first 2 chapters formulate the tattva, or the nature of reality, and the third deals with the hita, or sadhana, and the 4th brings out the purusartha, or the supreme ideal of life. Badarayana's Brahma Sutras are the aphorisms which systemize the teachings of the Upanishads. Śrī Rāmānuja, taking these sutras to be 544 in number, elucidated them in his famous commentary, Śrī Bhāsya, from a theistic standpoint. The present compendium in English of the Śrī Bhāsya is similar to an earlier one of Sri Shankara's commentary on the Brahma Sutras by Swami Vireswananda. The foreword presents a scholarly resume of the Śrī Bhāsya. The introduction contains an illuminating commentary study of the commentaries by Shankara, Rāmānuja, Vallabha, Nimbarka, and Madhva. It concludes with a section drawing attention to the harmony underlying these different commentaries. Apologies in advance for mispronunciations. I chose this one over the version concentrating on Shankara's commentary because I find Rāmānuja's qualified non-dualism a little bit more interesting to me. The text attributed to Badarayana, designated Brahma Sutra or Sharika Sutra, occupies the foremost position of authority in the system of Vedanta. That there were commentaries on it even before Sri Shankara, we learn explicitly from Sri Shankara himself, whose commentary is the earliest available now. Its central status in Vedanta is thus very well established. This is understandable, as it explicitly endeavors to formulate, elaborate, and defend the philosophy of the Upanishads in the full-fledged darshana style. The Bhagavad Gita seems to accord to it this pivotal status in the one significant reference we have in it. All the commentators seem to identify the author Badarayana with Veda Vyasa. The Advaitic tradition, handed down both by Vikaspati and Prakashatman, is unanimous on this point. The sutras fall into a magnificent pattern. The first chapter brings out the coherent import of the Upanishads by elucidating the apparently doubtful import of certain pronouncements. The second chapter works out a philosophical defense of the Vedantic standpoint in the context of adverse systems of thought. The third chapter outlines the spiritual pathway to the supreme goal of life, while the fourth chapter discusses the nature of that goal itself. The pre-Rāmānuja position. In spite of the greatness of the design, the sutras offer insuperable difficulties. Except a few, the sutras in general do not indicate the theme of discussion or the particular line of thought adopted. They definitely require an interpretive tradition to convey their import. Hence, authoritative commentaries utilizing such tradition or traditions were supplied from time to time. Sri Shankara refers to the Vertikara in the context, and Śrī Rāmānuja refers to an extensive Virti by Bodhayana. Sri Shankara's commentary is the earliest and a very substantial work of elucidation. He propounds a specific school of philosophy as sponsored by the sutras. Its distinctive features are that it asserts the sole reality of the Absolute Spirit, named Brahman in the Upanishads, regards the external world as only phenomenally real, and identifies the essential self in man with Brahman. Man's supreme perfection lies in apprehension of this identity through the realization of the import of the fundamental propositions of the Upanishads. It appears, as is evident in the next significant commentary of Bhaskara, that this formulation of the philosophy of the sutras was found to be unacceptable to a considerable section of Vedantic philosophers. They seem to have felt that the Brahma Sutra, while affirming Brahman, does not negate the reality of the world, nor identify the individual spirit with the Absolute so wholly. And the way to blessedness is knowledge that springs from karma yoga and matures into upasana, or devotional meditation. There was a strong current of the mysticism of love, or bhakti, standardized by the greater Puranas, the Bhagavad Gita, the Agamas, and the experience of high-ranking and God-intoxicated saints. Sri Yamunacharya seems to have yearned for a competent and adequate commentary on the sutras, integrating all these doctrinal and spiritual points of view. He was convinced that the truth promulgated by Badarayana lay in this direction, but could not himself produce the much-needed work of interpretation. Śrī Bhāsya. The prayers of the saintly Yamuna were to be fulfilled by his grand disciple, Śrī Rāmānuja. Providence destined Śrī Rāmānuja to accomplish the great task of elucidating the sutras in a theistic style, asserting the metaphysical immanence of Brahman, without the supplementary thesis of world denial and the denial of the individuality of the finite selves, and promulgating knowledge of Brahman as arising from karma yoga and maturing in bhakti. Śrī Rāmānuja has bequeathed 3 works on the Brahma Sutra: the Vedanta Sara, the Vedanta Dipa, and the Śrī Bhāsya. The first work merely enunciates the meaning of the sutras. The second goes beyond this summary of conclusions and indicates the dialectical framework. The third is the fullest and all-sufficient commentary. Pious tradition records that the goddess Sarasvati was so charmed by it that she blessed it with the prefix Śrī. Śrī Rāmānuja lived a long and full life. He seems to have spent nearly half of it in equipping himself for the creation of this masterpiece. He did advance his special philosophical point of view in his early work, the Vedartha Samgraha, in a brilliant and spirited manner. But he acquired devoutly all that Sri Yamuna's tradition could give him on the sutras, studied ancient documents on the sutras such as the works of Bodhayana, Tanka, and Dramita, mastered the current schools of philosophy to perfection, soaked himself in the Vedic literature, particularly the Upanishads, acquired an authentic understanding of the commentaries of Sri Shankara, Bhaskara, and Yadava Prakasha, got the core of the Advaitic classics of the masters such as Mandana, Padmapada, Sureshvara, Vakaspati Mishra, Vimuk Tatman, Prakashatman, and shaped his own vision of Vedanta and an appropriate style before he addressed himself to the literary mission of his life. No wonder the Śrī Bhāsya is a stupendous and masterly work, its style matching its substance. Sri Rāmānuja chooses the hard way on every issue, that of thoroughness, and he is massive in the statement of prima facie views and also in his vindication of his own grand findings. The language of exposition is lucid as well as grand. Vedanta Deshika, himself a great master of style, acknowledges that his own style acquired grace through a devout application to the writings of Sri Rāmānuja. In the compass of vision, fullness of execution, and splendor of style, the Śrī Bhāsya reaches heights of excellence. And a little bit from the introduction. A comparative study of the commentaries on the Brahma Sutras. All philosophical ideas in India can be traced to their source in the Vedas. These ideas were there even in the Samhitas, and were later on developed in the Aranyakas and the Upanishads. Yet the Upanishadic thought did not constitute any consistent system, but was merely a record of the spiritual experiences of the Aryan race, which developed later on into various systems of philosophy. These different systems grew side by side in the various centers of learning in the country, till they became very unwieldy and required regular systematization. Thus systematic treatises were written which were in the form of short aphorisms called sutras, or clues to long discussions on particular topics. The maximum of thought was compressed into as few words as possible, and this desire for brevity was carried to such extremes that the sutra literature now is unintelligible, and the Vedanta Sutras, too, are no exception to this. Badarayana, to whom the authorship of the Brahma Sutras is ascribed, was not the only one who had tried to systematize the philosophy of the Upanishads. In the Brahma Sutras itself we find the names of Audulomi, Kasha Krishna, Badari, and others, whose views have been either accepted or rejected by the author. This shows that there were other schools of Vedanta besides Badarayana's, though probably his was the latest and best, and so has survived time. All the Vedantic sects in India today hold his work to be the great authority, and the various acharyas who have founded a sect have commented on these sutras. The oldest extant commentary on it is by Shankara, the exponent of monism. Shankara was followed by a host of commentators, all of whom have raised their voice against the monistic explanation of Shankara and his doctrine of Maya, and have given a theistic interpretation of these sutras. But there are various shades of difference amongst themselves. Madhva refers to 21 commentaries on these sutras extant in his day. Each of these commentators tried to maintain that his system is the one that Badarayana propounded through the sutras. It has already been stated that the sutra literature, owing to its extreme brevity of thought, is unintelligible. This difficulty becomes greatly enhanced in the absence of an unbroken tradition. While there is an accepted tradition as regards the division into chapters, adhyayas, and sections, padas, there is no such tradition as regards the division into topics, adhikaranas, nor as regards the texts of the scriptures, shruti, that are discussed therein. Again, the same sutra sometimes yields just the opposite meaning by a mere shifting of the stops. The total number of sutras, too, differs in the various commentaries, and sometimes a single sutra is split into two, or two sutras are combined into one, or a sutra is dropped, or a new one added. The readings of the sutras also differ in the various commentaries, and the addition of a single letter, like but, and, or the negative, makes the meaning completely different. Some of the words, too, used in the sutras are very ambiguous, for in the Upanishads themselves they convey different meanings in different places. All this gives the commentators freedom to interpret the sutras according to their predilections. It is not possible to do justice to a vast subject like this, viz. A comparative study of the various bhāshyas, in so short an introduction as this. So we shall consider only a few of the bhāshyas, those of Shankara, Bhaskara, Rāmānuja, Nimbarka, Madhva, and Vallabha, and that too on a few salient topics, taking some significant sutras only into consideration. Yeah, when I first recorded this, I skipped the introduction and wanted to start reading straight from the sutras themselves, but it took me a long time to understand the actual organization of the book, and I'm still sort of working it out. So I thought it would just be better to read some of that introductory material to maybe give a taste of how vast and confusing, and as they say in some cases unintelligible if you don't have a commentary, this subject really is. But this is a nice little hardback published by Advaita Ashrama, which is associated with the Ramakrishna math. And let's move on to the next one. And another book published by the Ramakrishna math, a book on meditation by the monks of the Ramakrishna order. Originally from 1975, with different chapters written by different monks. Introduction, The Context of Meditation, by Swami Bhavananda. Before we begin a detailed study of the practice and theory of meditation, we must first consider the context in which this pursuit is to take place. Success in meditation is closely related to peaceful living. For meditation to be fruitful, the mind must be calm, and if the mind is to be calm, we must conduct our normal life and activities in a peaceful way. A prayerful attitude in relation to work is most helpful. Whatever activity we may be involved in, we must practice awareness of the divine presence in every situation. You may say that this is difficult to do in the midst of occupations, which require our full attention. Granted, but it is also a fact that as soon as a preoccupying activity is completed, we can return our mind to the presence of God. And if we are honest, we will discover that many tasks do not require the full attention which we give them, thereby wasting much of our time. Just before and after sleep, while engaged in manual work, such as serving or cleaning, attending to some of our bodily needs. All these are times which we could transform into a kind of conscious prayer and remembrance of God. Introducing the act of remembering God into our daily occupations helps to prevent many a distracting thought seeking entrance to our mind. Many useless and sometimes damaging desires come up which can be easily stifled thereby. By these methods, the mind becomes tuned to the meditative mood. When we sit for the practice of meditation at the appointed hours, it easily becomes stilled and concentrated. Disturbance from outside, in the form of sense perceptions, or from inside, from the subconscious, can be easily turned aside. Thus may a regulated, deliberately planned daily routine assist us in improving our interior life. One of the Desert Fathers records his reflections on the subject as follows. The science of sciences and the art of arts is the capacity to master harmful thoughts. The method and remedy against them is to watch with God's help for appearance of their suggestion and always to keep the thought pure. Just as we protect our physical eye, watching sharply for anything which might injure it and not letting even a speck of dust come near it. End quote. For attaining concentrated meditation on God, unrelenting watch over our daily thought habits is essential, over our words, actions, thoughts, character, and heart. This is what Sri Krishna tells us in chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita. Quote, by such constant and steadfast application, a person subdues the mind and attains the peace that resides in me, the peace that passeth understanding. Yoga is not for him who eats too much, nor for him who eats too little. It is not for him who sleeps too much or too little. For him who is temperate in food and recreation, temperate in his exertion at work, and temperate in sleep, yoga puts an end to all sorrows. Verses 16 to 17. Those who have been practicing meditation are surely aware of how much effort has been put into the process. It is the nature of the mind to flit from one perception to another, and it is truly difficult to place it where one wants it, and to keep it restrained. Whether we care to admit it or not, the condition of the mind depends much upon the condition of the body. It will be no exaggeration to say that unless the latter is kept in a healthy and manageable condition, to study the mind will be virtually impossible. In the above verses, we are told how to deal with the physical side of our organism so as to keep it in reasonably good shape. Food is essential for the upkeep of the body, but if the quantity is too much or the quality too rich, our blood and energies will be kept at the stomach level only. Concentration of the blood supply at the stomach level drains it away from the brain and makes it dull. Overeating and steady mental effort are poor companions. On the other hand, meditation is not possible for a starving man, and an undernourished brain can never make the fine discriminations required for spiritual life. Swami Vivekananda used to say, quote, "Religion is not for empty stomachs. First food and then religion. To the hungry, God comes in the form of food." End quote. Buddha, after passing through severe austerities, adopted and taught a moderate path as regards food. With respect to sleep, too much makes one dull and indulgent. On the other hand, too much of keeping vigil may cause us to be sleepy throughout the day, endangering our work, or peevish and a source of irritation to others. Keeping regular hours of sleep reinvigorates and gives rest to the brain. Not only regulated food and sleep, but regulated recreation and work have their place in our normal everyday life. They are especially helpful in the pursuit of meditation, with which we aim to make spiritual progress. We must take advantage of all these aids, and at the same time avoid all hindering obstacles. One who sits for meditation with such preparation of body and mind naturally gets his mind quickly calm and steady. Undistracted meditation becomes easy and natural, quote, "like the flame of a candle, undisturbed by any breeze," end quote. The Gita tells us in another place. The example has a special significance here. Mind, when concentrated on God, is intrinsically luminous. It is in that light that one perceives the all-pervading reality. It is the light of knowledge, steady, bright, and one-pointed. Of what avail are prayer and japa, repetition of a holy name, in implementing our life of meditation? For those who believe in God, both of these are very effective means of achieving mental concentration and experiencing the divine awareness. Prayer need not always take a formal expression. One can talk to God in a most direct way, opening one's heart to Him as one would do to a trusted friend. With no reservations and with no receptive barriers, one should converse with his Lord. Prayers to Him should be direct and issuing from the heart. Read a little bit more. Jesus told his disciples that men ought always to pray. He himself was always in prayer. We often forget this. Prayer, for any spiritually minded person, is no part-time occupation. For a man who has faith in God, all activities are prayers of a sort: walking, sitting, working, eating, playing. Such a man lives, like Brother Lawrence, in the presence of God, and his actions are offering of prayer unto Him. In Christianity, various mantras, holy names and words are used for japa. The name of Jesus itself is a mantra. The now familiar Jesus prayer of the Eastern Church, quote, "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me," end quote, is another. St. Francis used to sit up all night saying, quote, "My God and my all, my God and my all," end quote, in ecstasy. Jesus constantly remembered his heavenly Father. Without taking God's name, Abba, Father, he did not initiate undertakings. Abba was his last prayer at Gethsemane, his last word on the cross. Repetition of a mantra should also be especially practiced at fixed times by all spiritual aspirants. Okay, let's keep it moving. All right, this is Phantastes and Lilith, two novels by George MacDonald, with an introduction by C.S. Lewis. It must be more than 30 years ago that I bought Phantastes. A few hours later, I knew that I had crossed a great frontier. What it actually did to me was to convert, even to baptize my imagination. In those words, C.S. Lewis reported his first encounter with George MacDonald, the great 19th century innovator of modern fantasy writing. And thanks in good part to Lewis's appreciation, MacDonald came to influence not only Lewis himself, but also Charles Williams, J.R.R. Tolkien, and others. Well before Lewis's rediscovery, however, George MacDonald had earned an international reputation, and in 1872 and 1873 he went on what was to prove a highly acclaimed and very successful lecture tour of the United States. Now, 100 years later, the complete stories and fairy tales of MacDonald, except for several longer stories readily available elsewhere, have been collected in a 2-volume edition edited and introduced by Glenn Sadler. I do not write, MacDonald said, for children, but for the childlike, whether of 5 or 50 or 75. Here, for the childlike of all ages, is a collection of fantasy and fairy tales certain to delight both confirmed MacDonald readers and those who will meet him here for the first time. So this is referencing this other collection, The Gifts of the Child Christ. But let's go ahead and read the beginning of Phantastes, or Phantastes. A fairy romance. Phantastes from their fount, all shapes deriving, in new habiliments can quickly dight. From Fletcher's Purple Island. No idea what that means. Chapter 1, A Spirit. The undulating woods and silent well, and rippling rivulet and evening gloom, now deepening the dark shades for speech assuming, held commune with him, as if he and it were all that was. Shelley's Alastor. I awoke one morning with the usual perplexity of mind which accompanies the return of consciousness. As I lay and looked through the eastern window of my room, a faint streak of peach color, dividing a cloud that just rose above the low swell of the horizon, announced the approach of the sun. As my thoughts, with a deep and apparently dreamless sleep, had dissolved, began again to assume crystalline forms, the strange events of the foregoing night presented themselves anew to my wandering consciousness. The day before had been my 21st birthday. Among other ceremonies investing me with my legal rights, the keys of an old secretary, in which my father had kept his private papers, had been delivered up to me. As soon as I was left alone, I ordered lights in the chamber where the secretary stood, the first lights that had been there for many a year, for, since my father's death, the room had been left undisturbed. But, as if the darkness had been too long an inmate to be easily expelled, and had dyed with blackness the walls to which, bat-like, it had clung, these tapers served but ill to light up the gloomy hangings, and served to throw yet darker shadows into the hollows of the deep-wrought cornice. Beautiful sentence. All the further portions of the room lay shrouded in a mystery whose deepest folds were gathered around the dark oak cabinet, which I now approached with a strange mingling of reverence and curiosity. Perhaps, like a geologist, I was about to turn up to the light some of the buried strata of the human world, with its fossil remains charred by passion and petrified by tears. Perhaps I was to learn how my father, whose personal history was unknown to me, had woven his web of story, how he had found the world and how the world had left him. Perhaps I was to find only the records of lands and monies, how gotten and how secured, coming down from strange men, and through troublous times, to me, who knew little or nothing of them all. To solve my speculations, and to dispel the awe which was fast gathering around me, as if the dead were drawing near, I approached the secretary, and having found the key that fitted the upper portion, I opened it with some difficulty, drew near it a heavy, high-backed chair, and sat down before a multitude of little drawers and slides and pigeonholes. But the door of a little cupboard in the center especially attracted my interest, as if there lay the secret of this long-hidden world. Its key I found. One of the rusty hinges cracked and broke as I opened the door. It revealed a number of small pigeonholes. These, however, being but shallow compared with the depth of those around the little cupboard, the outer ones reaching to the back of the desk, I concluded that there must be some accessible space behind, and found, indeed, that they were formed in a separate framework, which admitted of the whole being pulled out in one piece. Behind, I found a sort of flexible portcullis of small bars of wood laid close together horizontally. After long search, and trying many ways to move it, I discovered at last a scarcely projecting point of steel on one side. I pressed this repeatedly and hard with the point of an old tool that was lying near, till at length it yielded inwards, and the little slide, flying up suddenly, disclosed a chamber, empty, except that in one corner lay a little heap of withered rose leaves, whose long-lived scent had long since departed, and, in another, a small packet of papers, tied with a bit of ribbon, whose color had gone with the rose scent. Almost fearing to touch them, they witnessed so mutely to the law of oblivion. I leaned back in my chair, and regarded them for a moment, when suddenly there stood on the threshold of the little chamber, as though she had just emerged from its depth, a tiny woman form, as perfect in shape as if she had been a small Greek statuette roused to life and motion. Her dress was a kind that could never grow old-fashioned, because it was simply natural. A robe plaited in a band around the neck and confined by a belt about the waist descended to her feet. It was only afterwards, however, that I took notice of her dress, although my surprise was by no means of so overpowering a degree as such an apparition might naturally be expected to excite. Seeing, however, as I suppose, some astonishment in my countenance, she came forward within a yard of me and said, in a voice that strangely recalled the sensation of twilight and reedy river banks and a low wind, even in this deathly room, "Enodos, you never saw such a little creature before, did you?" "No," said I, "and indeed I hardly believe I do now." "Ah! That is always the way with you men. You believe nothing the first time, and it is foolish enough to let mere repetition convince you of what you consider in itself unbelievable. I am not going to argue with you, however, but to grant you a wish." Here I could not help interrupting her with the foolish speech, of which, however, I had no cause to repent. "How can such a very little creature as you grant or refuse anything?" "Is that all the philosophy you have gained in 21 years?" said she. "Form is much, but size is nothing. It is a mere matter of relation. I suppose your 6-foot lordship does not feel altogether insignificant, though to others you do look small beside your old Uncle Ralph, who rises above you a great half-foot at least. But size is of so little consequence with me that I may as well accommodate myself to your foolish prejudices." So saying, she leapt from the desk upon the floor, where she stood a tall, gracious lady, with pale face and large blue eyes. Her dark hair flowed behind, wavy but uncurled, down to her waist, and against it her form stood clear in its robe of white. "Now," said she, "you will believe me." And let's read the beginning of Lilith. So I think this was the story that I bought this book for. Lilith, a romance. Off, Lilith. The Kabbalah. And here's a long quote from Thoreau's Walking, which I guess I'll read because it's here for a reason. "I took a walk on Spaulding's farm the other afternoon. I saw the setting sun lighting up the opposite side of a stately pine wood. Its golden rays straggled into the aisles of the wood as into some noble hall. I was impressed as if some ancient and altogether admirable and shining family had settled there in that part of the land called Concord, unknown to me, to whom the sun was servant, who had not gone into society in the village, who had not been called on. I saw their park, their pleasure ground, beyond through the wood, in Spaulding's cranberry meadow. The pines furnished them with gables as they grew. Their house was not obvious to vision. Their trees grew through it. I do not know whether I heard the sounds of a suppressed hilarity or not. They seemed to recline on the sunbeams. Beautiful. They have sons and daughters. They are quite well. The farmer's cart path, which leads directly through their hall, does not in the least put them out, as the muddy bottom of a pool is sometimes seen through the reflected skies. They never heard of Spaulding, and do not know that he is their neighbor, notwithstanding I heard him whistle as he drove his team through the house. Nothing can equal the serenity of their lives. Their coat of arms is simply a lichen. I saw it painted on the pines and oaks. Their attics were in the tops of the trees. They are of no politics. There was no noise of labor. I did not perceive that they were weaving or spinning, yet I did detect, when the wind lulled and hearing was done away, the finest imaginable sweet musical hum, as of a distant hive in May, which perchance was the sound of their thinking. They had no idle thoughts, and no one without could see their work, for their industry was not, as in knots and excrescences embayed. But I find it difficult to remember them. They fade irrevocably out of my mind even now while I speak and endeavor to recall them and recollect myself. It is only after a long and serious effort to recollect my best thoughts that I become again aware of their cohabitancy. If it were not for such families as this, I think I should move out of Concord. Chapter 1. The Library. I had just finished my studies at Oxford and was taking a brief holiday from work before assuming definitely the management of the estate. My father died when I was yet a child. So a similar setup to the other story. My mother followed him within a year, and I was nearly as much alone in the world as a man might find himself. I had made a little acquaintance with the history of my ancestors. Almost the only thing I knew concerning them was that a notable number of them had been given to study. I had myself so far inherited the tendency as to devote a good deal of my time, though, I confess, after a somewhat desultory fashion, to the physical sciences. It was chiefly the wonder they woke that drew me. I was constantly seeing, and on the outlook to see, strange analogies, not only between the facts of different sciences of the same order, or between physical and metaphysical facts, but between physical hypotheses and suggestions glimmering out of the metaphysical dreams into which I was in the habit of falling. I was at the same time much given to a premature indulgence of the impulse to turn hypothesis into theory. Of my mental peculiarities there is no occasion to say more. The house as well as the family was of some antiquity, but no description of it is necessary to the understanding of my narrative. It contained a fine library, whose growth began before the invention of printing, and had continued to my own time, greatly influenced, of course, by changes of taste and pursuit. Nothing surely can more impress upon a man the transitory nature of possession than his succeeding to an ancient property. Like a moving panorama, mine had passed from before many eyes, and is now slowly flitting from before my own. The library, although duly considered in many alterations of the house and additions to it, had nevertheless, like an encroaching state, absorbed one room after another until it occupied the greater part of the ground floor. Its chief room was large, and the walls of it were covered with books almost to the ceiling. The rooms into which it overflowed were of various sizes and shapes, and communicated in modes as various, by doors, by open arches, by short passages, by steps up and steps down. In the great room I mainly spent my time, reading books of science, old as well as new, for the history of the human mind in relation to supposed knowledge was what most of all interested me. Ptolemy, Dante, the two Bacons, and Boyle were even more to me than Darwin or Maxwell, as so much nearer the vanished van breaking into the dark of ignorance. In the evening of a gloomy day of August, I was sitting in my usual place, my back to one of the windows, reading. It had rained the greater part of the morning and afternoon, but just as the sun was setting, the clouds parted in front of him, and he shone into the room. I rose and looked out the window. In the center of the great lawn, the feathering top of the fountain column was filled with his red glory. I turned to resume my seat, when my eye was caught by the same glory on the one picture in the room. A portrait, in a sort of niche or little shrine sunk for it in the expanse of book-filled shelves. I knew it as the likeness of one of my ancestors, but had never even wondered why it hung there alone, and not in the gallery, or one of the great rooms, among the other family portraits. The direct sunlight brought out the painting wonderfully. For the first time I seemed to see it, and for the first time it seemed to respond to my look. With my eyes full of the light reflected from it, something, I could not tell what, made me turn and cast a glance to the farther end of the room, when I saw, or seemed to see, a tall figure reaching up a hand to a bookshelf. The next instant, my vision apparently rectified by the comparative dusk, I saw no one, and concluded that my optic nerves had been momentarily affected from within. I resumed my reading, and would doubtless have forgotten the vague, evanescent impression, had it not been that, having occasion a moment after to consult a certain volume, I found but a gap in the row where it ought to have stood, and the same instant remembered that just there I had seen, or fancied I saw, the old man in search of a book. I looked all about the spot, but in vain. The next morning, however, there it was, just where I had thought to find it. I knew of no one in the house likely to be interested in such a book. 3 days after, another and yet odder thing took place. In one of the walls was the low, narrow door of a closet, containing some of the oldest and rarest of the books. It was a very thick door, with a projecting frame, and it had been the fancy of some ancestor to cross it with shallow shelves, filled with book-backs only. The harmless trick may be excused by the fact that the titles of the sham backs were either humorously original, or those of books long beyond hope of recovery. I had a great liking for the masked door. To complete the illusion of it, some inventive workman apparently had shoved in, on the top of one of the rows, a part of a volume thin enough to lie between it and the bottom of the next shelf. He had cut away diagonally a considerable portion, and fixed the remnant with one of its open corners, projecting beyond the book-backs. The binding of the mutilated volume was limp vellum, and one could open the corner far enough to see that it was manuscript upon parchment. Happening, as I sat reading, to raise my eyes from the page, my glance fell upon this door, and at once I saw that the book described, if book it may be called, was gone. Angrier than any worth I knew in it justified, I rang the bell, and the butler appeared. When I asked him if he knew what had befallen it, he turned pale, and assured me he did not. I could less easily doubt his word than my own eyes, for he had been all his life in the family, and a more faithful servant never lived. He left to me the impression, nevertheless, that he could have said something more. Very old-fashioned, but I really like the complicated sentence construction. This is a cool old copy. When was this from? Printed in 1979. Phantastes or Phantastes was first published in 1858 and Lilith in 1895. So a big jump there in between these two stories. This one smells great. All right, just a little recap and we'll get out of here. The Brahma Sūtras was $13 and nice hardback copy. I wanted to get this sort of foundational text of Vedanta, and having the additional commentary of Rāmānuja was what made me pick this copy. The meditation book by the monks of the Ramakrishna order was $11. And I have other books on meditation, but it was attractive to me to get one by the Ramakrishna monks because I just love Ramakrishna as a saint or religious figure in general of the modern era. And I would really recommend researching him or watching some documentaries or talks about him on YouTube or something like that. It's very valuable and meaningful. And the George MacDonald book was $23, which I feel like is a little expensive, but at least it's 2 books in one. So that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe got some ideas about something you might want to read in the future. And again, strong recommendation of Ben Smith's Doggerland. I love this book, and I hope you will too. Until next time, happy reading.